This is Nadeem Malik, and I have with me tonight Professor Noam Chomsky. Professor Chomsky doesn't need any introduction, but I need to introduce this series of Think Fest conversations to you again. The first conversation was with William Dalrymple. The second one was with Anatole Lieven. And now I have the privilege of talking to Professor Chomsky. I just want to give you a brief introduction to Professor Chomsky also, although he doesn't need any introductions. But still, for the sake of young people who are not terribly familiar with his life and his devotion and dedication to public service as possibly the world's leading public intellectual of our times. Professor Chomsky is a linguist and a philosopher, but that is how he's known in academic circles. But in progressive, intellectual, and political circles, he's a towering voice on the subject of politics, ideology, power, foreign policy, American hegemony, and so on and so forth. Things that shape the modern world. He has over 100 books to his credit. Can you believe it? Over 100 books. And he has over 24 honorary degrees from across the globe, from Harvard in America, Cambridge University in the UK, Calcutta, far away, and so on and so forth. Of course, he's an alumni of MIT. So without further ado, let me get straight to the question and answer session with Professor Chomsky. Noam, it's good to see you again after a long time.
Yes, I remember our visit very well.
Yes, a lot of people will not know because Noam Chomsky and his wife Carol at that time came to Pakistan in 2002 to give a series of lectures here in Lahore at our invitation, the invitation of the Daily Times, which I was editing at that time. And I can tell you one thing, we'd advertised it and many of us were not sure how well Lahoris were acquainted with Professor Chomsky's works. But in the end, we had a hall that was meant to accommodate 1,000 people. And in the end, we had to accommodate over 2,000 people. And we had to put people at the gates to stop people from gate crashing. That was the sort of interest Noam aroused at that time. And that is in 2002. So you can well imagine, it's been many years since he was in Lahore. And I was just asking him what sort of memories he carries of those days, a few days that he spent in Lahore.
It was a very enlightening visit, especially that lovely evening at your home.
Thank you. Well, I must tell you that Lahoris remember you with great fondness. When people found out that we were going to be talking to you tonight, a lot of them sent in questions. A lot of young people sent in a lot of questions. And I'm afraid that we will not be able to ask all those questions of you because we have only 45 minutes or so. But I will try and summarize many of them and in the hope that we can put them all together in terms of a coherence.
Okay.
So, Professor, the first question that I have on my agenda is a question a lot of people are asking, and I think you have answered it in different interviews, but I think for our Pakistani audiences, it would be great for you to tell us once again. President Bush talked about the arrival of a pandemic, the possibility or the threat of a pandemic. That was like 10 years ago. President Obama talked about it. Bill Gates has been talking about it. And yet, when it does happen, it seems America and the rest of the world are totally unprepared for it. How do you explain that?
Well, there's a very simple reason. President George H.W. Bush, the first Bush, back in 1990, established a scientific review board for the President Scientific Advisory Council, PSAC. Soon as Obama came into office, one of his first acts was to call the committee together, discuss crucial issues with them, and then he requested right away that they prepare a study on how to act in the case of a pandemic coming. It was understood that a pandemic was very likely after the SARS epidemic in 2003, coronavirus epidemic, was contained, but scientists knew that it was very likely that another and more severe one would come. They knew how to prepare for it. They had started working on vaccines. We can talk later about why that didn't proceed, but anyway, they began. So Obama did call on PSAC to provide a program for dealing with an eventual pandemic. And a few weeks later, they came up with a program. Government began to implement it. There were preparations in place. Well, in January 2017, President Trump took office. First things he did within the first few days was dismantle the entire system, throw it out. He also began eliminating the Scientific Advisory Council. This is, he's trying to turn the country into one that you will recognize, Pakistan, a country that has no interest in science. He wants the government to eliminate science. One of his, and in fact, the whole scientific advisory apparatus has pretty much been dismantled. He's following the advice of one of his favorite figures, Rush Limbaugh, to whom he gave the Presidential Medal of Honor, a radio television personality who reaches tens of millions of people. And he's the main source of information for Republicans, along with Fox News. And according to Limbaugh, there are four corners of deceit in the world. One of them is academia, the other is government, the other is media, and the last is science. They exist on the basis of deceit. Can't pay any attention to them. So that's one of the hallmarks of the administration. Trump went on to defund the Center for Disease Control and other health-related components of the government. The US did have programs in which scientists were working in China with Chinese scientists to try to identify potential coronaviruses deep in caves where there are bats and so on. Trump eliminated the programs. In 2017, US intelligence warned the government that there was a potential pandemic coming. They were dismissed. When the pandemic finally came, the United States was uniquely unprepared to deal with it. That's what happens when you throw science out the window, when you change policy to have one goal, enriching the wealthy and strengthening private power, and throw out everything else. That's what happens. Now, of course, you can't blame this entirely on Trump. There are deeper problems. The deeper problem is capitalism. It's a capitalist crisis. We should recognize that. In 2003, as I said, scientists were warning the world another virus is coming, maybe a worse one. Well, it's not enough to have the knowledge. Somebody has to do something about it. Who could it be? Well, the obvious candidate is the drug companies. They have all the resources, the huge profits. The World Trade Organization agreements give them enormous monopoly patent rights. They have profits coming out of their ears, but they can't do it because they follow capitalist logic, which is you do what's profitable. And it's not profitable to prepare for a catastrophe that'll come down the road. Well, there's an alternative, government. Actually, government does most of the research for vaccines and drugs anyway, then hands it over to private companies. Government has plenty of resources, outstanding laboratories, but they can't do it because of something called neoliberalism. You may recall when President Reagan, Margaret Thatcher came into office 40 years ago, their slogan was, "Government is the problem, not the solution." That means decisions have to be transferred from government, which is partially accountable to the population, into the hands of private tyrannies, corporations, which are totally unaccountable to the population. There is no alternative, as Thatcher put it. So the government is out. So therefore nobody can do it. So there was no preparation on the part of any of the governments that were subjected to the neoliberal plague. And it is a plague. It's been very harmful to people all over the world, very beneficial to the designers. Wealth has concentrated to an extraordinary degree. Corporations are more powerful than ever. Financial institutions, which are mostly predatory and harmful to the economy, have almost taken over the economy. It's been a general disaster. Leads to crisis after crisis. The 2008 crisis caused by financial institutions was pretty serious. They were bailed out. They assume that whatever they do, they don't want government to help people, but it has to be there to help them. That's happening again right now as we speak. The US government has produced an enormous stimulus, several $1 trillion. Most of it is being fed to banks. To banks to decide to do with what they want. You can guess what they're doing. The Treasury is pouring huge amounts of money into buying stocks and bonds to keep the stock market high. That benefits rich investors and management. It does almost nothing for the economy. They're not putting the money into the pockets of people, into developing infrastructure, into improving education and health, things that could actually grow the economy. It's a difference. It's a neoliberal society run for the benefit of private wealth and corporate, mostly financial power. So yes, there's disaster after disaster. Another pandemic is sure to come. Scientists are warning about it right now. It'll be worse than this one.
Yeah. But Professor Chomsky, I remember in October of 2019, there was something happening in Washington, D.C., I think it was Event 201, where a lot of people came and did a simulation exercise about what would happen in the event of a pandemic. And there are a lot of conspiracy theories going around that there was some knowledge about something that was about to happen in certain circles, but simulation exercise.
The simulation. Yes,
if you remember,
major
201.
2019, there was a major simulation, October 2019.
Yes.
Yes, it was a simulation of a potential. It was they ran through what could happen and what you should do about it. U.S. government totally ignored it. Totally. In fact, Europe ignored it too.
But this was so close to an event that was about to happen, so there are a lot of conspiracy theories about it. Do you buy any of that, or do you think this was just something that was in the pipeline, and they came and they discussed and they never came to any conclusions in terms of how to advise various governments?
Because under neoliberal rules, you pay no attention to what benefits people. You pay no attention to governments. You labor to put power in the hands of private wealth and private enterprises, the corporate system. That is the goal of policy. You can see it all over. Take the United States, which is in the lead. By now, wages have stagnated for 40 years. Real wages of American workers are about what they were 40 years ago.